Rebecca, would you press the recording? Yes. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody. Depends where you're joining us for this first migration research group at the University of Sheffield virtual seminar. And today we are joined by Alice Massari. And just quickly before I hand over to Alice and also the chair of today's event, I wanted to mention EMISCO book series, and EMISCO is co-sponsoring this event today. And over something like a decade, EMISCO published almost 100 books, which you can find online, and many of them are possible to be downloaded for free. And today we will focus on one of these books, which also is possible to be downloaded for free from the Springer website. I just wanted to mention that there is an open call for books, so you can win open access fee waiver for your book, but also if you're accepted to be published within this EMISCO book series, the payment is really not very high in comparison to some other publishers on the market. So not to take much longer, I would like to hand over to Dr. Lucy Mablin, who's chair of today's event, and I'm happy that so many of you are today with us.
Hi everybody, welcome to this event on visual securitization. Hopefully you can hear me. I think I've been having some internet problems connecting, but I'm sure you'll let me know if you can't hear me. So today, a talk from Alice Massari. She's worked in the humanitarian sector since 2007 as a researcher, aid worker and consultant. So she's an overachiever, obviously. She trained in international relations, political science and European politics, and is currently working as a humanitarian affairs officer for the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. And she's also worked as an expert on migration for the European Commission and as an aid worker for NGOs in Africa and the Middle East. In 2021, she was awarded a Marie Curie Global Fellowship for a project exploring the role of visuality in governance. And as you can see from the abstract, which you must have read already, her research and writing focuses on migration, humanitarianism, visuality and securitization. So we're going to have a presentation from Alice first for about 25 minutes, and then we have a prestigious discussant who's going to respond with some thoughts about this presentation, Lene Hansen, who is professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Copenhagen. So Lene is author of Security as Practice, Discourse Analysis and the Bosnian Wall with Barry Buzan, and with Barry Buzan of the Evolution of International Security Studies. Her current research focuses on visual international politics, gender and security and critical security studies, as well as discourse analysis and foreign policy, and critical methodologies and world politics. So she's an excellent discussant for this presentation and really well suited. And one of the things that these online seminars afford is being able to have wonderful people from far away to be able to participate in that way. So we'll hear from from Alice, then we will have some thoughts from Lene. Alice will reply to those comments or questions, and then we can open it up for general questions. And you'll be able to either put a question in the chat function box, or you can see a little icon of a person with their hand up in the middle at the bottom, and you can do that if you would like to speak aloud your question. Okay, so I'll hand over to Alice now.
Thank you, Lucy, and good morning, everyone. Of course, thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to present my book. As you mentioned, visual securitization stems from the encounter of my two professional lives, the academic research with my work in the humanitarian sector as a practitioner in the field and currently as humanitarian consultant. Very briefly, this book is an account of how humanitarian organization visual depiction of Syrian displacement contributes to the to reproduce and sometimes reinforce a securitized account of refugees. Today I will present the major findings and try to outline the theoretical framework and the methodological approach of the research that led to this book. I cannot share in this version. Sorry, 1 second. I could until, yeah, sorry, my fault. Everything started from the observation that people on the move, refugees and migrants, have become one of the most prominent figures of our times. Images of overcrowded boats in the Mediterranean Sea, refugee camps, improvised shelters along the migration route, children and family in need, have come to constitute a powerful reminder of today's condition of global displacement. And in this crowded visual landscape, a question arose: how do we see the refugees? The visual representation is certainly dominated by media accounts. However, today more than ever, humanitarian organizations and NGOs, in particular non-governmental organizations, are among the main actors in the field that, while performing their work, produce large bulk of the images that contribute to shape our understanding of the refugee issue. This is where my research puzzle originated. How do transnational humanitarian NGOs represent refugees? And what are the implications of this visual depiction within the larger role that relief agencies play in global governance? My book focused on the way humanitarian NGOs have visually represented Syria displacement over the years of the so-called European refugee crisis between 2015 and 2016. This book is drawing on the literature that has highlighted the key role that NGOs play in global governance, with a particular attention to the security dimension. It draws extensively on the securitization theory developed by the Copenhagen School, of which Professor Hansen is a prominent member, a school that has broadened the notion of security, conceptualizing its fundamental discursive dimension. Therefore, inspired by the international security studies literature, I built up on the body of scholarship that has focused on the interconnection between securitization and humanitarianism to show empirically how NGOs have contributed to the securitization of the refugee issue. To do so, I have analyzed transnational humanitarian organization visual discourses, and the analysis is based on the understanding, of course, that NGOs do not operate in a vacuum, but rather in a highly competitive environment in which they compete for fund, public support, and media attention. So in this sense, I also draw extensively on the literature that has investigated the characteristic of humanitarian visual communication. However, as I mentioned earlier, my study is also a study on visuality, and it's probably worth to spend a few words on its visual approach. Particularly, I'm building on the scholarship that has investigated the role of images in international relations and the political function of representation. Within this large body of literature, I'm mostly focusing on the studies that explored the relationship between visuality and security. Regarding the visual analysis per se, I decided to use a combination of visual methodologies: visual social semiotics, for its attention to semiotic resources within situated cultural and social context, and iconography, for its potential in identifying visual trends and patterns in a large body of images. Finally, my research is deeply based on the literature that has pointed out how photos, far from being objective mirrors of reality, constitute in all and for all interpretation of that reality, and how they imply specific power perspective and ideological meaning. Through a multimodal analysis, I have explored over 1,000 images of the 4 major transnational NGOs active in the so-called European refugee crisis, namely CARE, Save the Children, Médecins Sans Frontières, and Oxfam. And I focused in the way in which the visual representation has reproduced or reinforced or challenged a securitized account of refugees. The book is based on three main findings. First of all, the study has shed light the different ways in which the major transnational NGOs participate to global governance. Secondly, I have empirically explored how the NGOs through their visual representation are contributing to the securitization of Syrian displacement. At the same time, I argue that humanitarian organizations, in their attempt to challenge mainstream securitized account on refugees, and particularly on Syrian refugees, they are also creating what an author has called minor displacement. I would like to go through the main findings one by one, if you allow me. The first is about the role that NGOs play in global governance. The analysis has highlighted that, albeit quite diverse in terms of background, focus, and sector of intervention, these Save the Children, Oxfam, and CARE all embody the typical organization of what some scholars have defined the new humanitarianism. They all heavily depend from government-based forms of funding. They have embraced the collaboration with private sector as a positive opportunity, and in all three cases, the humanitarian goal has been combined with long-term development objectives in the aim of a holistic approach, ideally able to tackle the root causes of the crisis. Most importantly, the three organizations have strongly embraced a right-based approach to humanitarian action that is interested in the individual as a right holder, whose needs can be tackled only intervening on the political, economic, religious, and cultural factors that prevent the enjoyment of those rights. These substantial transformative ambitions are paradigmatic of three organizations' intentions to play an active role in global governance. For the three organizations, their work in shaping, changing, and inspiring policy change in the society within which they operate is intended as a fundamental part of their mission. Paradoxically, however, the three organizations strongly claim to operate in a political dimension. They all understand and present their work as purely technical, and they do so through their focus on rights, considered as a neutral dimension located outside any political sphere. Against this background, MSF presents and performs its role in an almost total opposition to the other three NGOs. In fact, the organization has chosen to focus on a purely humanitarian mandate, to limit its intervention mainly to medical assistance and provide aid on the base on needs instead of rights. This organizational model is combined with a quasi-independence from government-based funds. In this sense, MSF has opted for a unique position according to which the organization does not claim any role in global governance, but rather frequently stresses its only medical and emergency intention. At the same time, however, the NGO is the only one that has repeatedly stated that politics is an important dimension of its humanitarian work. Now that we have seen a little bit the positioning of the NGOs, we can pass to the visual analysis and to see how they contribute to the securitization. I use three analytical themes to express the findings of my research. Those are threatened, threatening, and invisibilities. Let's start with threatening theme. With threatening, I intend the NGO's pictures that have contributed to reproduce the mainstream securitized media and political accounts that have depicted refugees in terms of threat. In this category, I found different aesthetic patterns that contribute to this discursive process of securitization. For instance, pictures of war, what I call vectoriality, that refers to picture of long lines of people pointing visually inside a familiar territory with no visual sign or goal in front of them, that in this way evocate penetrating arrows, support the narrative of the invasion. Or the visual topic of the boat, with the quite familiar photos of overcrowded boats produced by relief agencies that have, despite the use of innovative and alternative visual elements, continued to depict boat people as dehumanized and incumbent masses, eliciting feelings of fear. More generally, all images evoking emergency support a rhetoric of crisis and invasion that have pervaded populist and media securitized discourses on global mobility in general and the European refugee crisis in particular. To the threatening category also belong the images that consistently represent Syrians in abstract terms, essentialized people on the move with no individuality, agency, political claim, or personal trajectories. In a similar way, pictures that represent the other in binary terms as someone alien from us do not only reproduce a narrative based on questions of luck rather than justice, and do not facilitate a comprehension of the wider political context, but reinforce an understanding of refugees as an exception and a threat to the otherwise normal order of things. This said, however, it is very important to notice that overall images of this kind are a minority and do not constitute a dominant form of humanitarian representation. However, their presence, even if marginal, acquires significant meaning when inscribed into the wider context of communication around refugees. This is because humanitarian discourse is commonly expected to defy securitized accounts and rather present an alternative narrative, a more humanitarian one. Against this background, I have shown how NGOs have, in this sense, failed to move away and challenge this securitized account, and to a certain extent, they have contributed to their reproduction and reinforcement. The second analytical theme is the one of the threatened subject. In this case, and much more consistently than in the previous one, NGOs are clearly trying to challenge media and populist political discourses that have represented people on the move as a threat, privileging a depiction of Syrian people as referent object of a threat, as threatened. This analytical theme is indeed the most widespread aesthetic pattern of contemporary humanitarian representation. In my study, I have demonstrated how this representation is, yes, opposite to the one of the threatening individual, but simultaneously just another form of securitization where Syrians are depicted as infantilized and passive victims in need of external intervention. Let me give you a few visual examples of what I'm trying to argue in my book. This picture of a little girl laying in her mother's lap in clear distress is a typical image of pity, an iconography that powerfully recalls images of religious pietas. Although this kind of representation are definitely functional to NGOs' intention to show suffering in order to promote emotional involvement and support, they also frame suffering in a way that, as Hannah Arendt has noticed, creates two groups, the lucky that observe and the unlucky one that are observed. The problem of this representation is that depicts the situation as a matter of luck, not justice. Moreover, if we look at the rest of images of pity, they predominantly show women and children, of course, although overall I did not find that humanitarian visual material represents women more than men, but it does when it represents pity, as if the female body were the sign of an intrinsic vulnerability. Another very typical visual theme is that of the victim. The little girl in the picture on the top is crying outside of a tent for the effects of the tear gas. used on refugees by the Hungarian police at the Hungary-Serbia border. We know all this from the post that was accompanying the picture on Facebook, because at the visual level, the threat, the context, family presence, all are completely invisible. We can see how this image, together with many others of this kind, continues to contribute to the representation of Syrian people on the move in terms of what Lisa Malki has defined helpless and passive victims, a victimization that has been widely discussed in the literature. Beside this typical depiction, there is also a new visual representation of victimhood. And I put a picture on the bottom of this slide, what I would like to call the right holder victim, an individual, typically a child, represented with dignity in a confident pose, but still with no agency and in need of external protection to address his or her abused rights. The right holder victim representation works like what I would like to call a Troy horse effect. It is deceiving because at first it seems to defy traditional representation of people on the move as helpless, but eventually reproduces a discourse in which the right holder is still a victim and not a particularly active one. He or she is threatened as his or her rights are threatened, and this situation needs external intervention for protection. Nonetheless, the polysemic feature of photography allows for both meaning to be present. While putting the individual and the rights at the center of the attention, it simultaneously reproduces a representation of the right holder in terms of victimhood. My point is that all these different depictions of Syrian people on the move as threatened has failed to fulfill the emancipatory promise of the right-based human security framework. Indeed, the diverse visual team, far from empowering or emancipating the humanitarian subject, weaken any political claim they may have, and rather inscribe them into a dynamic of dependency requiring external intervention. In this sense, humanitarian intervention is strictly interrelated with securitization discourses and practices, as it becomes one of the most legitimate security strategies to address human insecurity. Finally, the analysis of what is invisible and what is visible in the transnational humanitarian NGOs' photographic representation of Syrian displacement has shown how visual absence can also contribute to securitization. And in particular, I've seen that politics and protest are completely absent from the picture reproduced by NGOs. Their absence can be explained by different reasons. The intention to protect humanitarian beneficiaries from potential security repercussions, or to not reproduce an account of them as threatening. However, the invisibility of politics and protest has also the effect of silencing refugees and depriving them of political agency. The exploration of NGOs' photos has also highlighted how the various factors that are causing the suffering in Syria and the displacement are completely overlooked. The only images connected to the topic of the threat are in fact those showing destruction or devastation, but with always the same absentee, the perpetrators. This invisibility, equivalent to the linguistic omission of specific grammatical elements, is not just a stylistic choice, but bears political implication insofar it produces an account that conceals the real causes of threat. In my investigation of visual absence, I have also considered its auditive equivalent, silence. In this sense, the analysis has demonstrated how, despite the significant effort put in by NGOs in making refugees' voices heard, the mediatization of the process and the constant representation of people through the lenses of their humanitarian needs have the ultimate effect of silencing refugees and reproducing an account that depicts them mostly, if not exclusively, in terms of humanitarian subjects, with very limited agency and only in need of external intervention. To conclude on a more positive note, I believe that it's equally important to acknowledge the possibilities for change. To use a visual metaphor, my analysis has in fact also identified what I would like to call glimmers. These are minor displacement in the humanitarian discourse at large, and spaces of visibility that have the potentiality to produce an alternative humanitarian discourse. First of all, fieldwork has revealed that NGOs are putting in a great deal of effort in going beyond a securitized framework. And this is not a small detail. The humanitarian enterprise has shown over the last few decades high level of internal reflexivity. The emphasis that NGOs, written policies, and practitioners put on the importance of considering and depicting the beneficiaries of assistance with dignity, empowerment, and agencies are important signs of the direction that relief organizations are attempting to move toward. Secondly, by focusing specifically on visuality, this study has shown that the visual presence of a wider range of aesthetic themes could also prove to be extremely useful in representing the experience of displacement, with more attention to its complexity. The visual presence of the threat, perpetrators, border regime apparatus, but also aesthetic patterns related to everydayness, routine, and the various strategies through which people navigate the strange interplay between protracted emergency and normalization beyond the dominant rhetoric focused only on the humanitarian needs, are important visual clues that, when they are included in the images, contribute to illustrate the interconnection between humanitarian situation of people represented and the wider social political dynamics. Capitalizing on this attempt of more complex and problematized visual narratives and using media technology that allow images interconnection would allow NGOs' representation of refugees to go beyond an essentialist and politicized depiction in terms of humanitarian subject, and ultimately provide a much more comprehensive portrait of refugee situation. My book argues that it's precisely in these more inclusive forms of communication that we can glimpse the glimmers of an alternative discourse to the mainstream securitized one. And thank you very much. I look forward to hear Lene and the question that may arise. Over.
Many thanks, Alice. It's absolutely fascinating. Can I invite Professor Hansen now to offer her thoughts on the presentation?
Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me now. I see Alice nodding, so I think it's a good time. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be offered the opportunity to give comments on Alice's fantastic work. I think it's a really amazing study that she's written. So if you haven't read the book already, I strongly encourage you to do so. I think there are so many contributions that it makes to the field of visual international politics, to the field of migration studies, and also I think gives us particular knowledge about how NGOs work as actors or players in international politics, and particularly in this field. And I think also the combination of mixed methods that Alice adopts is really just very impressive. And as we said in the introduction to this talk, that the fact that you have this sort of rich experience going into writing this book, I think also really comes through. So I really want to encourage you all to read it in more detail. So the comments that I have are two main sort of set of comments, and I was thinking of also, again, listening to your presentation, Alice, about how Susan Sontag, one of the most famous writers on photography of the sort of late 20th century, how she talked about in her last book regarding the pain of others, how photographs haunt us. that they're different from narratives, and they do something differently. And Sontag, of course, has been both receiving much praise and also much criticism. And I think that if we are looking to photographs, I think they do both, right? They both have the ability to haunt us in some cases, with iconic photographs like the one of Alan Kurdi perhaps being the most famous iconic one from the European refugee so-called crisis in 2015. But I think they also become part of narratives. And I think that what you're bringing out, Alice, is actually also how they become part of narratives and how they become part of communicating into debates over security, securitization of migration, and also then what should be done politically. So I mean, also in that sense, the NGOs, even though not all of them see themselves as political actors, I think in a meta level, there are political actors into this field, because the whole field itself of migration politics is political. So I think they're both haunting, but they're also narratives. And I think if we're going, through to the study of photographs for one of the other, big visual theorists that you have up on the slide, Alice, Roland Barthes. He spoke very famously about the connotations and the denotations that photographs have, and it's virtually impossible to describe a photograph simply in terms of its denotation, what's in it, without bringing some connotation into the image. And also that one of the key practices that were sort of giving us some anchoring of photos in terms of the many connotations that they could possibly have is the role of text, and linguistic messages and how they anchor. So I think that this sort of both, the haunting capacity of photos, like the one you're showing us, the one with the slide with pity of the little child who's looking, right at us, and also referencing the Pieta motif. And then also the role of discourses and text and so on in terms of providing particular image to a photo. I think that that's, in a sense, working on visual politics, that's the kind of both theoretical and empirical kind of, I wouldn't say tension, but field that you're working with, of having the individual photo speak to us, and at the same time also looking to the multiple ways in which that photographs can and are being used and brought in to communicate something more specifically. So that was kind of my opening kind of set of reflections, and then my sort of first more sort of question to you, Alice, is how much the sort of how much polysemic status do we want the photograph to have, when we're working with this? And I was thinking about that also now in your your presentation, the slide that you have with the threatening photographs and with the abstract, which I thought was really interesting, where there's also a child, right? But it's a sort of a more blurred child. So I just, if you can flesh out a little bit more about your thoughts in terms of how we're able to connect particular visual motif to a particular discourse, right? And how we navigate that sort of knowing from Barthes that there are multiple ways in which that at least some motive can be anchored and brought in politically. So if we can take the example of the abstract, if you could say a little bit more about how you're theorizing and going about making that connection between particular motifs and whether they threaten or threatening. And then I thought also, along that, I was also, wondering at a more sort of, not necessarily, it's not just empirical, it's also theoretical level. If we have particular motifs that have a polysemic capacity to them, let's take the example of the overcrowded boat. Which of course is also one of, if you're working on the visualization of boat migration, the crowded boat has become in numerous studies pointed out as a sort of invoking a discourse of threats and the need to control borders and so on. But I also read an analysis by Vollmer and Kaya Kali, from 2018, where they're doing a detailed study of the German case, and they're pointing to how the overcrowded boat early in the visualization of the refugee crisis was actually constituted as a sort of what they say, as a not as a threat metaphor, but something that actually had, you know, more positive, more humanitarian connotations. So if there is some flexibility in terms of how particular generic motif become constituted, what does that pose in terms of challenges for the NGOs, particularly the ones that might be operating? I mean, this is your field, but I know that CARE, for example, has a CARE Denmark. Right? So there's also, you know, marketing and campaigns directed to national audiences. And there's also, I imagine, sort of, you know, the visualization that takes place at the level of the NGO as such. So I wondered if you could say a bit more about how the NGOs are they thinking about this? How, you know, how are the differences between particular domestic, you know, settings as a venue for, you know, for them to also seek to gain support for their work. The second comment that I had, which also follows on for this, is about emotions, and particularly the slide you showed with the photo of pity. And here again, I'm just more as a sort of opening to further your you know, your thoughts on this than a sort of, you know, critical question as such. Is I think that the question of emotions is one which is so central to work on visual politics, and it's also one which is so difficult because a photo can, if we're using Sontag, can sort of haunt us, but does it haunt us in a particular, does it communicate a particular emotion? Right? And how do we get to what emotion it possibly expresses? I think, but that's also because I'm coming to this from a very sort of discursive tradition, that it's really hard to pinpoint the emotional status of photographs unless we're looking at what is said about them. You know, how they're constituted in discourse, but also, you know, how they're, you know, being used in visual practices. So I just wondered if you could say a bit more about how in your work, if you come across how NGOs also through their textual discourse might be actually in seeking to invoke emotions, you know, through this sort of textual anchoring that Bart's was talking about. Right? So if we're saying that we don't necessarily feel a particular emotion when we're seeing a photograph, just as a theoretical starting point, you know, do the NGOs do something to invoke particular emotional registers, not just through, you know, the visual itself, but also through other, through use of text, for example, or possibly through other forms of practices. And particularly here, I was thinking of the sort of the challenge I could imagine for NGOs also, you know, that some of the motifs that we would often, you know, situate within an emotional register, like I think you were right to doing with the Pietà photo, also have the danger that they might become visual cliches. That if photos are start to be seen as visual cliches that NGOs, for example, are using to invoke our emotions and to make us, you know, send money and so on, then it actually goes from being something that would have the kind of, you know, visual political effect, and to actually having the opposite. So in that sense, you know, the constitution of the same photo is one that is genuinely, you know, seeking to humanitarianize or invoke emotions and so on, but also being one that can potentially be flipped over and being seen as a strategic, you know, way to, you know, manipulate with what an audience sees. So I just wondered if you could say, you know, just a bit more about that. And then sort of finally, which I know is also just a super really big question, but again, I was thinking, you know, based on your excellent presentation and your excellent work, is the question of agency. And I think when your discussion of the two different photos of the girl and you know, the differences between the one where she's crying and the one that she's looking at us, and you know, is there a possibility to see agency in that photo? And I think that really speaks to a much larger question, which is, how do we identify an agentic photo? And you see, is it when people are performing an action, like if they're fighting or beating up or throwing themselves against fences and so on. But I think that there's something really difficult about that question also in the field of those of us who are working on visual politics, and particularly with migration, because it's almost as if, and that's coming back to Sontag, it's almost as if we want the photograph to communicate agency outside of the frame itself. Right. So I think that there is something here about the relationship between theorizing agency and the photograph that actually makes it difficult in some ways to actually have a true agentic photo, unless we're also coupling that photograph to something that is done before, after, and outside of it. So thank you so much for again being able to engage with your great work, Alice, and thank you so much for having me provide these reflections.
Thank you so much, Lene. Can I invite Alice to respond to some of your questions and thoughts?
Yes, of course. Thank you very much, Lene, for the comments and the question. Always very insightful. I probably start with the last one because it's one of the things I'm most passionate about. Probably also because I work partly in this sector. I really care about the fact that it's important, the visual representation. So the critique is fine, but yeah, it has to be constructive. And the lack of agency is something that NGOs are proactively looking for. And I think that we cannot deny that. And their effort is visible in many, many ways. But still, I don't think it's visible at the visual level, at the analysis of the images yet. I interrogated myself a lot about what would a picture showing agency would be, and also how can we represent this condition that certainly has part of agency, but also contains pain, can be depicted without either falling into a stereotypical image of suffering or an happy-go-lucky representation of everything is fine. I think that the answer was given me by some images that I could find in my photos, in the photos produced by NGOs, in their complexity or in the link between more than one image. In this sense, for instance, technology, if we think at the possibilities to do photo documentaries or to show 10 pictures of one person showing different parts of his life, they have huge opportunities to show the complexity of lives, including agency, including pain, of course, but including also everything that goes around, goes on in the condition of displacement. And this links also to, I'm going to your comment backward. This links to your discourse on emotion, which I completely agree. And it is true, it's really difficult to look at emotions if we don't look at the discourses. But maybe there's one visual methodology that I used, which is iconology, can help us here. Exactly because of I think it makes the link between the literature, the text level, and the visual, because it looks at how how emotions have been represented visually over a long period of times or in a specific geographical area, for example. So when we can identify a visual pattern, then it's easier because, of course, as you rightly state, all images are polysemous. So one image of pain or pietas can still be an image of care, of loss, or of fear. And we can see all of those elements, but iconology allows us, for instance, to acknowledge all those emotions in one picture and then try to make sense of it. And the way I tried to make sense of it was the visual social semiotics. And on the boat representation, this is really interesting, and I think it really, what you mentioned, the article you mentioned, makes a lot of sense. And the only thing I would say about it is that I don't think that a humanitarian representation and a more political media representation in a securitized way are so antithetical as the authors would suggest. And this is all my point, that the humanitarian representation, unless goes toward a more documentary and purely journalistic and more engaged activity, risks to reproduce or enforce stereotypical or mainstream representation. And I addressed polysemy. I would just add something that, of course, an image would be read in difficult ways in different parts of the world and in different moment in time. So what I tried with my book is to give a reading of these images as member of the audience to which they are directed, because they are directed to a Western world that is supposed to donate for this distant suffering. And so I brought my geographical and cultural and historical reading into the interpretation, which is something that Barth also was not only allowing but considering, because it's the only way to bring meaning to an image. And of course, it's situated, and we should not forget that. I hope I very briefly addressed your comments, which were super, super interesting, and I will need to think much more about them. But thank you so much, and I'm happy to take more questions.
Thank you so much, Alice. It's interesting to hear the dialogue, and if we have time later, perhaps Lene and yourself maybe Lene can come back on some of that. Can I just invite the first question? Abdul Fattah has had his hand up for a period of time, so let's invite him to ask his question. Abdul, you found it, yeah. We can't hear you, although it doesn't say that you're muted. I wonder if it's an issue with your computer, Abdul Fattah. Could you check your sound settings? But can I, perhaps in the interest of time, could you type your question in the chat box and I will read it out? And while you're doing that, we'll go to Magella, who has typed a question in the chat box, asking about agency. So she's interested in the role of participatory research methods in producing images from refugees themselves. And I was also interested in what the outcome of this reflexivity that you mentioned is. So do NGOs work in a participatory way to co-produce images, or any other measures to act upon the reflections they've been doing?
This is very interesting, because what I found is that they do, and many of them have in their mandate this ambition to bring voices to bring out the voices of the voiceless. Although in my analysis of what the samples of images we had, we cannot really see an auto-representation. It's a process that is so mediatized. The NGO role is so in the middle that really distance the voice of the people who are trying to give us self-representation, and the NGOs that are trying to give them voice. So this is not something I've seen so far. And it's interesting, another anecdote that a photograph who was carrying out a photographic workshop in one of the refugee camps in Jordan told me this was a workshop organized by one of the NGOs teaching refugees to take pictures and edit them and also include captions. And when she asked young adolescents, teenagers to put captions on their pictures, there was this image of a child with a doll, and she was super happy and super melancholic about the doll. And the caption said, "This is because I won it from my brother. We always fight about it." So if we would seen the picture alone, we would probably automatically think about the loss, the fact that she doesn't have any other toy to play with, that she's completely alone without friends. But that picture for her and her brother was about a game that they were playing and their victory. So without taking, of course, nothing out of the pain of the situation, there's so much more complexity that we are without the auto representation we are not able to capture. And there are many exercises of participatory research methods, including participatory representation, that so far have given limited solution to this.
Thank you. That's fantastic. I haven't yet seen the question from Abdul Fattah in the chat, so I'm going to go straight to Maurice Still, who put his hand up earlier. Are you still there, Maurice?
I think I am. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, great. Well, thanks for the presentation. I really enjoyed it, and I think these questions are just continuously pressing. I was just wondering if you had seen a sort of development, right, in the portrayal of people on the move, right? So we see that there are some NGOs, and I work in the Mediterranean context a lot, have become much more critical over time, right? So like there are these more sort of radical NGOs that have also criticized other NGOs in the way in which they have used imagery. And it's of course not only just linked to these sort of women and children narrative, but also in terms of actual process of criminalization, right? So when you circulate pictures and images of boats and it shows, for example, the driver, right, this can directly go into the criminalization of this individual. So I was wondering if you had also detected some sort of evolution over time, right? Maybe a shift towards sort of a more critical engagement with it. I mean, you pointed to it a little bit. And then, as someone who's also a practitioner in the field, right? So we have sort of these participation of people on the move, right? So for example, I work for the Alarm Phone Network, which is a hotline for people in distress in the Mediterranean Sea. And so when we talk to people in distress, they also want us to use their voices sometimes, right? So like they want us to sort of highlight their distress situation, and of course often saying producing these narratives of human rights and so on. Just pointing this out, I think, to say that there are some actors that are directly implicated in or constantly sort of discussing how to use voices, images, and narratives in sort of real time, and it's obviously a very complicated process.
Thank you, Maurice. Yes, the critical engagement is fundamental, and I think that it's one of the optimistic outcomes of my research, the fact that people that are working in the field are increasingly aware of what should be done and what should not be done, although probably visuality comes a little slower. And there's a very meaningful article, very old, Campbell, I'm sure Lene knows it, 2004, I think, that was showing how the visual and textual narratives about the genocide in Darfur were completely detached. So I'm not surprised that we can see NGOs and policies and practitioners with a very high level of reflexivity, awareness, and critical engagement, also because of their engagement maybe with academia. And on the other side, the result of the communication is still very much linked to very mainstream and traditional ways. But of course, it's something that I acknowledge and I agree with you. It's really important, and I hope it's gonna be like the trigger of changement. On the voices, I see your point, and my point is not is absolutely that important. It would be important to hear the voices directly, but in the way in which many NGOs interfere in this process, the voices are completely lost. Imagine if you could give a message to the world and then it's presented by an NGO saying, for privacy reason, that my name is not Alice Massari, but it's Sarah, I don't know what, and another age, because they don't want to locate me, position me exactly in my body. So this is something NGOs would probably have to give a further thought. Okay.
Thank you, Alice. We have a couple of questions from Abdel Fattah now. The first one is, and I'm sure you can see them in the chat, but have you compared these images to mainstream media images of securitization? So the NGO images, like how do you see that relationship? And then the second question relates to the way in which NGOs activities have historically been used for solidarity, but the war on terror, but that he has a perception that the war on terror has changed the perceptions and meanings of images and narratives. But which do you think is more securitizing, the texts or the images, or I suppose a relationship between them? So two really interesting questions there, Alice, for you.
Thank you, Abdul Fattah. I did not carry out research on media images. I really didn't have time, so I mainly used secondary sources and literature talking about mainstream media images on refugees. And it's usually acknowledged that their representation is much more securitized than NGOs. So my point was exactly to try to challenge this assumption. So I can't really speak to media images per se because it's not what I know firsthand. And what you're saying about NGOs' use of images for solidarity and passion, absolutely. That is, of course, true. And we should not forget that one of the reasons why these pictures are disseminated is for fundraising and support mobilization. So there are different also intentions behind the production of a picture that are not just probably the representation of reality, but of course other intention that we should of course acknowledge and take into consideration, especially if we consider that they are basically fighting in a very, very competitive marketing environment for funds, but also for attention, for public attention. The war on terror has changed radically the role of images and has elicited many both at the textual and visual level has elicited emotions probably more than other big narratives. NGOs did never connect the two, of course, and this was something that sometimes happened in the media and political accounts. What I would expect from NGOs in the past 20 years was to really be to build an opposite discourse, because what my book tries to argue that of course they were not reproducing the same discourse of fear, of closure, of contrast, but at the same time they failed to propose a completely alternative one. So thank you for your question. Over.
Thank you. Okay, so we have 3 questions from Annetta Picut now. So first, can you speak a little bit to the change in intensity and dynamic between the humanitarian or protection images and the securitization ones over time? What's the shift been over time? And then who do you think are the most powerful actors shaping visual representations? And then finally, a kind of, I guess, comment or methodological praise. It's really impressive to have analysed 1,000 images. And are they available anywhere to as a resource? But maybe also you might want to speak a little bit about the process of analysing those such a large quantity of images and how you went about it.
Sure. On the historical change of images, they changed a lot since the beginning of humanitarian communication. It was basically mostly based on the stereotypization of the sea of humanity, as Malkley has powerfully represented these pictures with thousands of people looking all the same, taken from very far away, that were intended to show the effects of humanitarian crisis, and very different images that we have now of much more close-up, sometimes close-up portrait of people. I think they changed a lot. Probably the problem of humanitarian communication before was more falling in the stereotype of the helpless and passive victim, while now we could add this new meaning of securitization. The most powerful actors shaping visual representation. I think that the NGO play and humanitarian organizations in general play a big part. Of course, we have the media, but in my new project, which is of course based on what I did, the research I carried out for my book, but it's going to be a completely new project. I identified other actors that I think are very important to consider, which are the institutional actors. In the case of Europe, the DG Home, which is in charge of migration policies, but also, for instance, artists. This is because the intellectual world has this power to very often challenge or present an alternative perspective. So there are different actors, more or less powerful, but I think it would be important to have a look at all of them, and this is what I would like to do in my next project, starting in January. So I'll tell you more if you give me 3-4 years time. Over the 1,000 pictures, it was really a long process. I do have them stored, of course, very basically stored in my laptop and on NVivo. I used NVivo because basically it allows to code every single image. It's like any other qualitative research software, but with the difference that you can code images. So the process is quite similar to what you would do for an interview, giving they have different names than the other softwares, but giving codes or classification nodes to certain features. For in my case, I started with what was objectively represented. So 1 person, 2 person, a group of people, female, male, adult, children, object, coffin, boat, etc. And then try to add complexity to all of my nodes, and then started to analyze them. That was a very long process, and I think visual social semiotics has never been applied before my research to such a large bulk of picture. Usually it's visual content analysis that is carried out on such large group of images.
And are these images available anywhere now, Alice?
No, because there's also, I mean, they're on my laptop, I could share them, but there's also license, I use a copyright issue linked to it. And this is something that anyone that is interested in the visuality and wants to publish on visuality should know. The use of images is of course very complicated, and using them afterward, it's complicated. So this is a whole, I know that at the ISA, for instance, they have specific panels on this because it's increasingly becoming a problem. I'm quite sure Professor Hansen has also found some challenges in her publication with images.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I guess Annetta and myself also have not, I mean, I've left images out of publications and books and things because of copyright, but not because they were the kind of core focus of my analysis. So that is a really interesting challenge that you have to face in that kind of research that we are perhaps slightly ignorant to. We have one more question, and I guess we'll probably leave it there because I think we're losing a few people to teaching commitments, etc., at the turn of the hour. But Rebecca Murray asks, did your analysis of the image also include? I think this goes a little bit Lena's comments about the different actors involved. And also the kind of selection of images. How did they select from presumably a larger body of images? And Rebecca has been involved in research on trafficking, which I think is where this question comes from. Also, did you compare with visual representations of trafficking, which are which overlap in some ways, and NGOs also trying to garner sympathy from those images? Some NGOs actively reproduce negative images, whilst others can't afford to produce their own, so actively kind of having a photo shoot to produce a particular kind of image of a harmful situation. So
yeah, this is an interesting question. Basically, I didn't use it as a let's say, as a code in my analysis, but it came up in my fieldwork because I visited all the three countries and carried out interviews. And I interviewed the communication and the advocacy staff of the NGOs, but also the photographers. It really depends from the NGOs, the budget that they have for their specific crisis, and the kind of material they decided. So it's a really different, we can find very different situation, and part of the analysis also takes into consideration the way in which these images are produced. Sometimes photographer had taken like a documentary style group of picture, and then one is chosen by the editor and the communication officer as representative, sometimes against the will of the photographer, not against because it's giving the copyright, but against its journalistic or photographic sensibility. So this is very interesting. It's not something I investigated at large in detail, but it's absolutely something that should have more attention. On trafficking, I don't have carried out research. I did an I wrote an article on smuggling, but it's not trafficking, and on the smugglers, on the visibility of the smugglers. But on trafficking and the victims, I can really not comment because I'm not an expert at all.
thank you so much, Alice. I'm just turning off my camera because I've had a notification that my connection is poor. I would just like to thank you for your fascinating presentation. Your book sounds absolutely fascinating, and since it's open access, nobody has any excuse not to read it. And also to Lene Hansen for giving such wonderful and interesting and engaged comments, which I learned a lot from, as well as the presentation. So thank you very much for coming, and a virtual clap and thanks for you.
Thank you very much, everyone, for attending and giving me this opportunity.
Thank you. I guess that's permission to leave also, by the way.
Thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you, Alice.
Thank you very much, and I hope it went well.
Thank you.
It was great. It was really good.
Bye-bye.
It was fantastic. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye. Bye.